Welcome back to Combat Mission Shock Force 2, where we're kicking things off with a bang. There goes a T-55NV belonging to Lancelot from the Few Good Men, who is attacking this map as the Syrians. At the other end of this engagement is Sergeant Silver's Challenger 2, which is set up to cover the open farmland on this flank. Challenger doesn't have any problem killing the T-55 at any reasonable distance, but it can only engage so many at once, and Lancelot has taken me by surprise a little by kicking the game off with a mass armour attack. There is a literal wave of T-55s surging out of his setup zone. Sergeant Silver and his crew go 2 for 2 with their second shot and take out another T-55, but then they're hit by two barrel-launched AT-10 Bastion anti-tank missiles in quick succession. Although one hits the gun mantlet and fails to penetrate, the other hits the muzzle of the Challenger's 120mm main gun and cripples it. In the first 30 seconds of the game, Lancelot is down 2 T-55s, but he scored a firepower kill on one of my Challengers. Sergeant Silver is out of the fight. A few metres away, Lieutenant Green's Challenger quickly knocks out a third T-55, and the Lieutenant proceeds to personally fill an AA technical full of 50 cal fire from the turret-mounted remote weapons system, but more shots pummel the front of Sergeant Silver's tank. There are no penetrations. The Challenger 2 is probably the best protected main battle tank in Shock Force 2, but the repeated impacts tear the tracks off, leaving Sergeant Silver and his crew stuck in the line of fire. Just to the north of the two Challengers, the Javelin section I had pushing forwards to cover the same flank has moved into a mortar barrage, so they're too busy making themselves small or getting wounded to help out. So at the end of turn 1, it's Lieutenant Green versus the whole Syrian army. This is an interesting game, but it's not a balanced game, hence the slightly different approach. This is only Lancelot's third multiplayer game, and despite some efforts to balance things out by playing on a map that he's made himself and forcing me to go through the force selection before I've seen the terrain, it's very one-sided. So, spoiler alert, the Brits win this one, but that's obviously not what makes it interesting. What we're going to be looking at is how the force selection, terrain analysis, planning and deployment all contributed to this game's result before it even started. So back to Lieutenant Green and his Challenger as he continues to engage the T-55s who are rushing forwards. This is why I brought Challengers along, and these two are in a pretty good position. They have their tough frontal armour facing towards the enemy, their weaker sides and rear aren't exposed, and unlucky hits on the gun barrel aside, they can quite happily exploit their field of fire to maximum effect. The problem is that while the Challenger's 120mm gun is pretty damn good, manually loading 120mm shells isn't that fast, resulting in a slower rate of fire than smaller caliber weapons, and the Syrians' combination of numbers and speed here means that most of them are going to get through. Luckily, Lieutenant Green and Sergeant Silver aren't alone. This is a huge scale battle, and I had a big pile of points to spend, so I brought 7 Challengers to this fight, and they are all in close proximity. This is an example of force selection, planning and deployment coming together. The key area of this map is a rough triangle around the villa objective. It's screened to the north by the mountainside and has good fields of fire to the left and to the right out over farmland. Any enemy forces that want to get to the objectives at the back of the map have to go past this triangle and either suffer flanking fire or switch to attacking my forces head on. We've already seen the 2 tanks I have covering the right. I have 2 more covering the left and 3 more in reserve at the base of the triangle. From here I can concentrate my Challengers against either flank very quickly by exploiting their central position. Lancelot is attacking my right in such strength that I'm redeploying my entire tank force to counter him. By the end of the second minute, after Lieutenant Green has scored 3 more kills and shrugged off a hit to the turret cheek, another Challenger is online and the others are close behind. One of them doesn't make it, it gets bogged down and immobilised in the muddy forest, but only a minute 15 after they started moving, the others are in position and the Syrian armour down in the farmland rapidly starts to evaporate. This is the interaction of mass firepower and speed at work. To start off with, The Syrians had the edge in mass and speed. While they were unlikely to destroy my two challengers, they were giving them so many targets that they were probably going to be able to absorb the losses and break through on this flank. This is the attacker's advantage. He can attack where he wants and he can concentrate forces at that point. The defender's advantage is that he can react once the attacker has shown his hand and concentrate his lesser force to best effect, providing that his deployment allows him to. This is why terrain analysis is so important. Being able to spot the critical areas of the map and deploy to exploit them yourself or deny them to the enemy is almost half the battle. The wave of T-55s and BMP-2s breaks up under the Challenger's firepower, and the survivors take refuge in the small forest on the right, where they're going to be safe for the time being. They are stuck there though. Going forward or falling back means coming out into the open and re-entering the killing fields of my challengers. I still effectively have nothing on that flank that is actually in the enemy's way though, which begs the question why. There is 800 meters worth of physical gap in my defense on the right. Wouldn't it have been smart to deploy an infantry force in the forest where they could take advantage of the short ranges and darkness to block the enemy? I do have some infantry. I have a company mounted in warriors, but they're not here. I have one platoon in the rear as reserve, and the other two in the triangle with the challengers, and the reason why is that I don't have a large enough force to cover the whole map. Forests might be good defensive terrain, but like urban areas they demand a high force to space ratio, and I simply don't have enough pixel shrubland to infest every wooded area on the map. I need 2/3 of my infantry just to have enough boots on the ground to protect the challengers in the triangle from the possibility of Syrian infantry sneaking up through the forest, so I've ended up with this gap on the right. But it's not a big deal. I don't have to have some kind of physical blocking force over there to stop the enemy because I can stop him with sheer firepower. By holding the triangle, I can dominate that flank with the challengers. This works pretty well on the right flank, which is very open. The left flank is mostly forest, so what's going on over there? Here we get the third component of my force. I brought challengers for killing power, and I brought infantry to hold ground and protect the challengers. The third part is my reconnaissance screen. As the name implies, my screening force is there to keep me informed about enemy movements. This wasn't so much of an issue on the right because the T-55 wave was pretty obvious, but in the denser terrain and more restricted sightlines on the left, there's a reasonable chance that the Syrians might pass by my forces in the triangle unnoticed. So I have the infantry company's fire support group out there. These are mounted in Land Rover Wimics for weapon mount installation kit, and they've got to be one of my favourite units for the Brits. They're small, fast on road, heavily armed for a light vehicle, with a passenger seat GPMG and a ring mount featuring either a 50 caliber machine gun or a GMG, and, most importantly, they are open vehicles with excellent all-round visibility. The crew all have night vision goggles, and the commander and gunner both have binoculars, so they make fantastic recce units. They also have 2 empty seats, so they can carry small teams to complement their firepower. In this case, I've brought along sniper teams from the Infantry Company HQ and the Battalion Maneuver Support Company to drop off as observation and listening posts. On the left, my screen is mostly sticking to the roads to avoid getting bogged down. One of the Wimics has got itself immobilised already, but the crew are able to dismount the GMG and continue on foot. And it's not long before I start getting infantry contacts in the forest. These are all quite a way away to begin with, and with no sign of any vehicular backup or transport, I can afford to ignore them for the time being. I also had elements of my recce screen on the right, backed up by a javelin section from the Battalion Maneuver Support Company, also in a Wimic, and these have very quickly found somewhere else to be. The reconnaissance screen is not there to fight tanks, it's there to provide early warning of enemy forces and intentions. Staying to fight a couple of companies of T-55 MVs is not going to end well, so on the right flank all my Land Rovers are hightailing it to positions further back, where they can screen the exits to the right hand forest and keep tabs on the Syrians who are stuck in there. They are leaving a sniper team behind though. These guys were dropped off in turn 1 and they've gone to ground in the forest to keep me informed about what's going on. This is almost entirely by listening to engine noise, though they do get a solid spot on a T-55, which wanders uncomfortably close. There's not much they can do about it without any actual anti-tank weapons, but that's fine because I don't want them to do anything about it. If Lancelot doesn't know they're there, they can keep feeding me info. The snipers aren't completely toothless. Their main weapon is an L115A3 rifle in 338 Lapua, but tucked away in their equipment they also have a laser designator, and when they spot another Syrian tank hiding in Lancelot's deployment zone, they get a chance to use it. The tank in question is a T-90SA, which hints at Lancelot's intentions. The T-55 I've seen so far are, as the name implies, old and pretty antiquated. They're not toothless by any stretch of the imagination, but they're cheap, plentiful and very dated compared to a shiny new T-90. It's very unlikely that Lancelot just has one of them scurried away back there, and their position seems to indicate that he's holding them in reserve. That's a useful bit of information, but in the short term I can use the sniper team to laze that T-90 and call down some precision artillery on it. This sniper team has a better time than the team I have out on the far left. After being dropped off by one of the Wimics, these two pixel truppen have gone up a nearby hill, which was probably a mistake. Here I was thinking more about actually seeing the enemy than just hearing him, and they're in such an obvious position that the Syrians stumble on them and wipe them out. This doesn't mean that things are going badly on this flank. The recce screen isn't supposed to fight to the last man, and they're putting plenty of hurt out as they give ground. The Syrian threat over here remains quite low. I've only seen one vehicle so far, and this was a BRDM that was quickly collared by 50 cal fire, so I don't need to swing the challengers over there to help out. Instead, I have the warriors of my infantry in the triangle contributing. Warrior is armed with a 30mm Radin cannon and a coaxial 7.62mm chain gun backed up by thermal optics, and they're able to hose down Syrian infantry squads crossing from right to left in front of them. It's unclear exactly how much damage they're doing, but every little helps, and in any case the idea here is to delay and wear down the enemy as he passes. Unlike the right flank, the comparatively restricted line of sight prevents me from bringing the full weight of firepower to bear in the forest, but to the south, off the skirt of the mountain, there is a chunk of more open farmland. The recce screen falls back and takes up positions here, where they can maintain contact with the enemy infantry, shoot them up, and let me know what they're up to. I have my 2nd infantry platoon standing by in the triangle to deal with them if necessary, and as always the option of detaching a couple of challengers to help out. If Lancelot sends his infantry across the open ground towards the city, I can swing my forces to the bottom left edge of the triangle and catch him in the open from that flank. If he sends them along the edge of the mountain plateau to attack the triangle directly, I can move so that he's attacking me head on in the forest, where I can fight to my own advantage. It's not totally smooth sailing with the recce screen. The Wimics are not armoured in the slightest, and one of them is taken out by an AT-14, but apart from this I'm able to minimise the risk by keeping my distance. By this time the situation is pretty stable. The challengers are keeping the enemy force in the right hand forest pinned in place, occasionally picking off T-55s or BMPs that they spot through the trees, and hammering enemy infantry trying to get across the open fields to the south. Enemy infantry is advancing on the left, but they're not getting anywhere fast, and as I just mentioned I have plans in place to deal with them. There is some enemy activity up on the mountain. Lancelot is pushing infantry up there too, but they're not only running into very one-sided firefights against my infantry teams in the forest, but I'm shelling the snot out of them. The final component of my force is my reserve, which is held back in the city. There is a forward observer here who is casually dropping 105s and 155s on targets of opportunity, but also a javelin platoon and my final infantry platoon. The javelins are mounted in GPMG Wimics, as noted earlier, which means that I can rush them to wherever I need to in short order. There are extra missiles in the vehicles too, and the 4 javelin teams are currently up in the buildings on the edge of the city, where they have a good view over the right hand forest. Just like the challengers, every now and again they make a spot and destroy an enemy vehicle, and I'm making sure to move them to a different building after every launch to make it harder for Lancelot to pinpoint them and get accurate return fire out. My reserve infantry platoon originally moved out behind the garrison objective on the right, standing by to repel any enemy troops who got past the challengers. This wasn't ideal, but by taking advantage of the urban terrain, they should at least have been able to slow the Syrians down long enough for me to redeploy forces from the triangle to catch them in the flank. That threat has receded, however, and with things being relatively quiet, I've moved them up to this berm below the farmland to mop up a few unfortunate Syrian infantrymen who've made it across. This is when Lancelot throws his reserve in. The T-90s start to move out, backed up by more infantry and a few BMPs. This push is running along the edge of the mountain slope, underneath the guns of my forces in the triangle, so it's taken advantage of the terrain in a way that the T-55 rush at the start didn't. The T-90s in particular are a bit of a pain, as they're able to engage some of my infantry on the mountain and force them to fall back, making life considerably easier for the Syrian infantry on the move up there. Repeated 120mm mortar barrages also make life uncomfortable for my infantry in the triangle, but I have my reserve forces on hand to get online and cover this new angle of attack. I only have 2 javelin teams left with ammunition, so these rush off to the garrison objective and get up on the roofs and into this tower, where they can see the Syrians tucked up against the slope. I'm also redeploying my challengers slightly, sending one to aid Lieutenant Green, and one across the map to bulk up my reserve infantry platoon and get that angle on the enemy beneath the triangle. This, as it turns out, is unnecessary in the end. The javelins pick off the 2 T-90s, and the enemy infantry coming around the corner are subjected to the 105s and close-range infantry fire from a section I have supporting the challengers on the triangle's right edge. As a final coup de grace, a concentration of enemy infantry in the right-hand forest gets introduced to the wonders of 155mm artillery, and with that we agree to a ceasefire. The result is a British Army major victory. Like I said at the start, this is an interesting game, not a balanced game. Lancelot has got nowhere near any of the objectives, and has suffered perhaps the most casualties I've ever seen in a combat mission game. He's lost 238 men dead, 120 wounded, 3 men taken prisoner, as well as 23 tanks and 16 BMPs destroyed, plus 4 light vehicles, trucks, AA technicals, that kind of thing. On the other hand, I've lost 17 men dead and 6 wounded, along with 8 Land Rovers of various types, some of which were destroyed after being abandoned in the mud. And this result was about 90% down to force selection, terrain analysis, planning and deployment. The number of tactical decisions I had to make was pretty low, and the number of tactical decisions I had to make that weren't already accounted for by my planning and deployment was even lower. A big component, however, was the way that my pre-battle decisions interacted with Lancelot's pre-battle decisions. He brought a lot of troops along. I don't think I've ever seen 1,000 enemy pixel truppen in a multiplayer game before, and we saw in the opening engagement that mass and speed can negate firepower in certain circumstances. He was also banking on me taking an out-of-the-box British force from the force selector, which would have had typical values, rendering it of higher quality, but considerably smaller. Overall, he didn't have a bad plan. He went in essentially aiming to pin me down across the front with sheer volume of conscript troops, and then commit his higher quality reserve at the decisive point. The main problem was the coordination between the different elements. First there was the T-55 and mechanised infantry rush, then the infantry in the forests on the left and the mountain, then finally the push underneath the triangle at the end. Individually, I was easily able to react to these threats. Dealing with them all at the same time would have meant making decisions about which to prioritise, making it more likely that the lower priorities would have gotten through and that I would have to have made more decisions. Having to make decisions is bad. The more you have to make, the higher the chance that you're going to make a mistake. Something that could have given the Syrians a huge boost here was air power. To some extent this comes down to knowing your enemy. The Brits in Shock Force 2 have no organic anti-air assets whatsoever, so they are perhaps uniquely vulnerable to enemy air attack, but some of the Syrian air power is so ludicrously cheap it's worth taking regardless. The prime example is the light anti-tank Mi-24D Hind option. It's only armed with a 12.7mm rotary cannon, so it's not going to bother a Challenger that much, but it'll shred light vehicles like the Wimics, and I was using those a lot. They were my reconnaissance screen and they were transporting my valuable Javelin teams around. If they were getting filled full of holes every time they got spotted, I would have had major problems. And the best part is that they are cheap as hell, 15 points each. For the price of one of those T-55 MVs from the start, Lancelot could have brought along 13 strafing Hinds and the forward observer needed to pull them in, and I wouldn't have been able to do anything about them. It is worth reiterating though that taking the Syrians out against any of the Blue Corps factions in Shock Force 2 is very difficult, and attacking them in a dusk battle is even harder, so Lancelot was really up against it here and deserves some kudos for going at it the way he did. He has his own YouTube channel, which I'll link in the description. There is some combat mission on there, so it's well worth a look. Overall, it's a battle with some interesting elements, and Lancelot's use of mass stands as a nice counterpoint to some of my other videos against players who went for quality over quantity, as well as demonstrating some of the basics of defense and how important all that pre-game preparation is. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll catch you in the next one.